Hey everyone, hopefully you can hear me. I'm gonna add Kain and Tyler right now, and then we'll get started here in just a few minutes.
What's up, Sir Dad?
Hey Tyler, there we go. Here you. Oh, and there we go. Kain's added as well.
Yeah, what's up, Kain?
Awesome.
Hey guys, what's happening?
Hey,
Uh,
good to talk to you both. I was just like, those are some familiar names I get to talk to today. It's like feels like we're back in fall 2020, and I've lived through over a year of staking SNX. I'm finally uh, above break even in my portfolio. And then I learn about BarnBridge with Tyler. I think I joined a clubhouse actually with Tyler back then. I'm pretty sure that's the way I like officially met Tyler. So,
Yeah,
anyways,
that sounds familiar actually. I
right?
remember
It's
that.
not that long
Yeah.
ago. It really I mean, I just saw the right as we were hopping on here that the ape coin had gone live, and happy for all the Bored Ape people, but I was like, man, times have changed. Ape coins. Who would have thought of that? Um,
I actually spent this morning looking at the BTC chart from 2016 because I don't know. There's something about like the last like month. I've just been getting like heavy 2016 vibes, right? Like, and it's
right?
actually funny when you go back and look at it, like it is literally just up and to the right the entire time. But I think everyone was like so uh, paranoid. Like every little dip felt like so painful in 2016. Like it felt like the bottom was just going to fall out of everything, and it feels really similar at the moment. Like every single little move, people are like so skittish. So yeah, I was just having a look at that chart. I think it's good to go back and look at history every once in a while. It's pretty funny. It starts at 400, ends at 800, which felt like a pretty good felt like a pretty good year. Now it's a good minute.
Yeah, yeah. No, I feel like Max Payne could still be uh, up, up and to the right here all throughout 2022. Just a lot of people bragging the last few months. Oh, clearly we're in a bear market. You know, it just I found some of the arrogance to be very cringy. So yeah, I would love for us to blast upwards here. Um, hey, maybe I should let either Kane or Tyler frame this up though, just because you guys have been working close together as Synthetix and BarnBridge. Um, and actually, let's do introductions first, just in case someone's listening and they don't know who either of you are. But yeah, do either of you want to kick off with that and then talk a bit about like why we set up this AMA today?
Kain, do you want me to do that, or do you want to do
Yeah,
that?
you go ahead. You go ahead. Then I'll do a quick intro. I'll
Yeah.
let you run it.
So the I think a lot of this was kicked off just generally in the fact that I think that BarnBridge and Synthetix have signaled like a pretty staunch commitment to optimism. And it for me, it was a lot of Synthetix bullishness around optimism as well as Aves, which everybody saw, like the Aave V3 launched on Optimism recently. Um, and so I think in both scenarios, there's a lot going on within, like both from BarnBridge's perspective, like pretty massive changes, and same with the whole Synthetix kind of mesh network of projects. And I think if you're not like in the Synthetix Discord or in the BarnBridge Discord, it's hard to actually see how much is actually happening in the optimism ecosystem in general. And so I think I originally asked Kain if he would hop on this. Um, really, more is just a chance to talk about uh, all of those things, like everything that's going on with Synthetix, everything that's going on with BarnBridge, the stuff that's coming to Optimism, kind of the whys around that. Um, because yeah, it's something that I'm definitely excited about.
Cool. Yeah. So obviously, quick intro, I guess, Kain from Synthetix, uh, founder of originally Haven, and then became Synthetix, and probably the biggest Optimism maxi out there, I would say. So yeah, as Tyler said, I think we're finally getting to a point here where we're starting to really see some cool stuff happen on Optimism. I think it's taken obviously a little bit longer than we might have liked, but just within the Synthetix ecosystem, there's a ton of cool stuff coming out. And I think we're really seeing other projects start to lean into it. I actually got pinged yesterday by a project that is building on Synthetix that has another project building on them on Optimism. And I think we're starting to see the composability vortex just suck people in to Optimism, and people are getting really excited about some of the things that they can do, which is awesome. It's taken a while to get here, but I think the wait's been worth it, and we're going to see some really cool stuff over the next like 3 to 6 months.
Hey guys, what could you talk a bit about like what goes into thinking about where you are going to build in terms of L2s or even side chains? What are some of the what's some of what factors into that decision about like where to build next?
Kain, I'll go after you on this one because my answer is probably less interesting, and I know that you've been pretty deep in the weeds on Optimism. And also, just so everyone knows, I just talked about the purpose of the call, but I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Tyler. I'm a co-founder of BarnBridge. But yeah, Kain, I think I should go after you on this one.
Cool. Yeah. So, look, the reality is that we ran into scaling in Synthetix much earlier than I think most projects did, for a number of reasons. One, we do regular iterative updates, and two, we had an extremely complex smart contract suite, which meant that even back in the day when you could get a transaction through for like 3 4 Gwei, people would still complain about the price of a Synthetix transaction because it was just an order of magnitude higher than a lot of other stuff that you were doing out there. And so we had this pressure from the beginning to really think about how do we kind of get to a point where we can optimize, reduce costs, scale, et cetera. And so we were always had that in mind. And then I think we had this idea of synthetic perps, which as it developed, over the course of like probably a couple of years, the complexity of the solution just kind of increased over time. At the same time as the background, gas price and block space kind of crunch that we felt on ETH1 really accelerated. And so when we got to a point, I think where we just realized that we were going to have to invest in a lot of R&D around where to scale, we kind of quickly found the Optimism team, and like we did with Chainlink, we developed a pretty close relationship with them, even pre-launch, and spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resources internally within our project to ensure that we were ready to kind of be live when Optimism was live. So I think that was fundamentally the reason for our decision going with Optimism. And then I think the kind of background reason, the kind of primary reason was just we wanted to stay within the Ethereum ecosystem. So obviously there were other L1s out there. BSC was available. We could have ported across to there. But the reality is that we saw the future as an Ethereum future. It just required scaling, and so that's kind of the primary driver of why we stuck to this idea of working with optimistic rollups, because I think in the short to medium term, which is probably the next like 2 to 3 years, I think optimistic rollups are going to dominate. That's something that maybe feels a little contrarian right now because of how long it's taken to get here, but I do think that the market's going to kind of recognize that pretty soon.
Hey, Kain, Can you, without going too deep into the weeds, having too technical of a conversation, why do you think that about optimistic rollups? In case anyone's unfamiliar with this, like there's different scaling solutions, and as Kain pointed out, it's contrarian because it's definitely been a talking point that ZK rollups, amongst some, not everyone, are superior. But anyways, optimistic rollups, I feel like have, you know, what I want to say, gone mainstream sooner. We've been able to use applications like Synthetix on Optimism, and then also on Arbitrum, which has lots of different applications. So, anyways, yeah, if you don't mind sharing a bit more about why you hold that view.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally there are a number of different ways that the broader smart contract ecosystem is going to scale, if we want to call it that, right? Like if we're talking about, complex smart contract systems running on various, various solutions. So obviously you've got L1s. One way of scaling is just have a bunch of L1s, and every time you add an L1, you just get extra capacity, right? So if you've got 100 different L1s, then great, you've got 100 times the capacity of what you might have on Ethereum. And then in some cases those L1s have different sets of trade-offs where you might get even more scalability. But I think that that's a future which is a little bit bleak if we just get to a point where we have this kind of proliferation of L1s, and we're already seeing the pain of people jumping across between different things and bridges, and all the challenges that brings from both a security standpoint as well as a usability standpoint. So it's hard for me to imagine a future where like a million L1s is the solution, right? And so then you go, okay, well, if the solution is not a bunch of different L1s, then maybe it's some optimized L1 that has like these magical properties where it's just like super scalable, right? But we've got this thing called the scalability trilemma, and no matter what you do, it's very challenging to kind of imagine a scenario where you have a single L1 that is going to be able to sort of service the demand for block space that the world is going to have over the next like 5 to 10 years. So then you say, okay, well, if it's not some single L1 and it's not a bunch of different L1s, then you need some other kind of technical solution, right? And we have probably, I think, 3 main solutions that are out there at the moment. One is you just build side chains and you kind of connect them back to the main L1, but that's really kind of almost a variant of like the L1 solution, just having a bunch of different L1s, right? And there's security trade-offs and a bunch of other trade-offs that are not ideal there. That said, I think Polygon's probably the best example of that. And as like an interim solution, it's not bad. I think myself and a lot of people that were kind of deep in the Ethereum ecosystem probably fucked this up. When we were sort of hesitant to advocate for people using Polygon. And then, even though a lot of people did, I think it opened up an opportunity for a lot of alt L1s to gain traction that might not have otherwise happened if we had just kind of accepted that the trade-off in the short term was right to go with the sidechain. But then sidechains again, I think are ultimately a dead end, right? And even Polygon's seen that. They're working on various different solutions. They've acquired a couple of other scaling solutions. So then you kind of have 2 technical solutions that are available to you. One is optimistic rollups, and the other one is some kind of zero knowledge scaling, right? Whether it's zero knowledge rollups or some other zero knowledge proof based system, both of which are kind of technical solutions to scaling that I think are the kind of primary pathway that we see within the smart contract space. So the question then is like, okay, which of these is better, right? And I think the answer that kind of leads a lot of people to say like it has to be some zero knowledge solution is that zero knowledge proofs are ultimately going to be much more efficient, right? The end state of scaling, I think, is some kind of zero knowledge system, right? Now the question then is like, okay, well then why are we bothering with optimistic rollups? Like if zero knowledge a zero knowledge solution is going to ultimately win, then are we kind of just wasting our time? The problem is that we actually are much closer to understanding how to implement an optimistic rollup based system, right? Like the gaps in our knowledge, from an implementation standpoint, are much smaller. And I think it's worth calling out that like none of the current optimistic rollups are sort of fully complete, if that makes sense, right? Like they don't have all of the properties that we want in an optimistic rollup system, but they're certainly much closer than some of the zero knowledge solutions. With the probably single caveat being, I think if you look at something like Starkware is a complete system. It works, but it has this extremely harsh trade-off right now, which is that you end up in this kind of siloed world where you lose composability, where you're able to run a single application, something like DYDX, for example, and you can run that extremely efficiently. And we've seen how effective that is for DYDX. And it allows for something like DYDX to compete with, let's say, BitMEX, right? That's running on centralized servers that, is completely centralized and doesn't have all of the properties that we're looking for in one of these systems, but it creates this silo. And so if you don't want to be siloed off in this, this specific place, and you want to maintain composability, and you want people to be able to get in and out of the system easily, to be able to compose and combine that system with other different smart contract systems, then Starkware is not really viable. And so then you get to this question of like, okay, well, which one of these things, some zero knowledge system or optimistic rollups, is going to be ready first? And the reality is that optimistic rollups are going to be ready much faster than a zero knowledge system. And in crypto, we have a very bad habit. I think, this is the case for a lot of software development, but I think it's particularly prevalent in crypto. We have this very bad habit of being, overly optimistic about how long something's going to take. And so when I look at the current landscape and say, okay, how long do we think that optimistic rollups are going to dominate? The answer is probably more on the order of years rather than, months. It's not like in 6 months' time, zero knowledge solutions are going to just, supersede optimistic rollups. So if that's the case, and we're talking, maybe 2, 3, 4, even 5 years of optimistic rollups being kind of the dominant solution that is feature complete, that's why we've leaned into this solution, and that's why we think that that's in the medium term the scaling solution that's going to support Ethereum. You also have this other aspect, which is that within the kind of L1 consensus research layer, I think that there's been a realization that this is the solution, right? This like idea of optimistic rollups and L1 being a data availability layer is the medium term solution. And so Vitalik and a bunch of people have posted about how to shift the L1 roadmap, so that when we get to E2, that or whatever we're calling it these days, when we get to a point where the merge happens, post merge, that we have an L1 consensus layer that is optimized for optimistic rollups. And I think if that's the case, and I think we get there this year, then that makes this kind of argument for why optimistic rollups are going to dominate even more powerful for an even longer amount of time. And then the reality is it just becomes obvious that you need to choose an optimistic rollup, whether it's Arbitrum or Optimism or one of the other variants, and you need to put all your weight behind it if you want to stay within the Ethereum ecosystem. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but hopefully that covers the kind of rationale of why we're here.
I'll also add to that and say that you can build ZK rollups inside of like Optimism. So like ultimately, where you have something like Starkware where you can run like single applications, the ability to get in and out of that L1 and like the way that all the bridges essentially work, it'd be kind of a mess if everybody had their own application specific rollup versus like, I mean, that's one of the reasons I never really thought that Polkadot was going to take off with application specific blockchains. I mean, Cosmos is doing a decent job on some of that, and they have a growing ecosystem. I'm not an ETH maxi, but where I do look at this is just the quality of dev talent, as well as liquidity. And so my reasoning on really pushing for Optimism was a little, I mean, I have a pretty in-depth understanding of optimistic rollups versus EKs, but the reason that I really pushed for it wasn't extremely technical. It wasn't extremely driven from a technical perspective. Like, we did look into Polygon and what the ZK that they just bought is doing. And I think that's a good solution. But ultimately, like, Uniswap, who has very, very, very deep liquidity, is focused on Optimism. Synthetix, which has a very, very, very engaged community, is focused on Optimism. And I had some of the Aave devs out at my house in Puerto Rico for this like Pleaser DAO retreat. And they said that they were focused on Optimism, which we saw come out with the Aave V3. And so if you have some of the deeper liquidity pools for capital markets, you have synthetic assets there, as well as very deep DEX liquidity, then it's hard to port that over. Like, we saw the vampire attack of SushiSwap to Uniswap, but ultimately Uniswap still won. Like, it's not that easy to port liquidity over like that. And so I don't think we're looking at a scenario that just some ZK rollup gets rolled out and it's so drastically superior to Optimism where everyone just ports over. And as far as the L1s go, most of these rollups, if I am looking at it from a technical perspective, they inherit a lot of the security of the base chain. And so if you're talking about, it's less important for BarnBridge because we don't have crazy amounts of TVL, but I have to assume that what we're building towards is going to be more successful than the V1 version. And the security does start to matter. Like, I wouldn't feel comfortable knowing that my entire DAO was on Solana or another L1 chain, because it's ultimately not as safe. Like, Ethereum is the safest, most distributed, most decentralized blockchain that can run smart contracts. Ultimately, Bitcoin is still the elephant in the room, and it's probably even more secure than Ethereum, but you can't run smart contracts on it. And so when you're building a financial protocol versus like an NFT protocol, the liquidity that's there is important, because fragmenting liquidity across all these systems is very capital inefficient. And then also just the security factor. Like, if I was a country or a nation state that was going to take out $1 trillion bond, it would have to be on Ethereum, the base layer. And that may be what the base layer of Ethereum turns into, is very large companies and like basically interstate transfers, because those transactions are going to go up in value. And so when I was looking at BarnBridge, similar to why Kain moved to Optimism, like, it was very clear, like, I was involved in the Synthetix ecosystem very early. It was very clear that the Synthetix product wasn't going to be extremely useful until there was like a drop in the fees. It's just one of the aspects of synthetic assets is they're pretty much traded by like prop desks and traditional Wall Street. And you're talking about tons and tons and tons of transactions in order to eke out like small alpha and like arbitrage mispricings. And so I think that's one of the reasons like Terra, for instance, has done well, is because they've taken a lot of shortcuts on security and scaling that Synthetix went the hard route, and I think it will pay off for them. But in the same way, BarnBridge, our products are a money Lego. So when you basically plug BarnBridge into Aave, you have to pay both deposit fees on mainnet. And at one point, the senior positions, if they're short term, 7 days or something like that, I mean, you have to, for like a 7-day deposit on BarnBridge into Aave, you need like $28 million at a 10% interest rate to break even just on the fees. And so basically I was looking at it saying, if I want to grow TVL, I want it to be somewhere safe. And it definitely needs to be cheaper, for a lot of the same reasons that Synthetix needs cheaper transactions. And that was a lot of what drove the decision. But then I started thinking through it and extrapolated that if a lot of our effort and innovation is going to be on Optimism, our DAO really needs to be there too. And the reasoning for that was that I basically did some calculations that because BarnBridge is one of the more distributed tokens in the ecosystem, like when you look at our token distribution on a pie chart, we are, I mean, when you say decentralized, we're not just talking about the number of wallets. I'm also talking about like the whale wallets and how much those whale wallets have. But there's a double-edged sword to that like success metric that I often like post on Twitter. Like, I'm the most proud of this chart because of how well distributed BarnBridge, the bond token, is on a pie chart. The other side of that was that I sat down and did the math, and 40% of our DAO couldn't involve themselves in governance without it costing more in Ethereum fees than what their entire bag was worth. So if you're doing this for the people and you want all these people to have a voice, pricing them out on base layer Ethereum with the assumption that, you know, gas fees are going to get worse, not better, over a period of time. They may drop in times like now that we're in Goblin Town and drop down to like 10 Guays, normally bottom. But over a period of time, the base layer ETH transactions will increase in cost. And so I figured that it was the right time to start making that move once I saw other, like I played around with Lyra and Tailies on Optimism, and it seemed fast, it worked. There were a lot of really good projects moving to it. And for a long time, I knew that our products and our DAO needed to end up on an L2.
Hey, sorry. Tyler, did you mean to cut out there, or did your mic just cut out?
Where did y'all hear me
No,
stop?
no, he was.
Oh,
I think he was wrapping up.
I think I was just done.
You were
I think he was
done. Yeah, that's exactly. No. Just making sure. Well, then I guess. Oh, there we go. Proving I'm still a dad. Got the kids running in. I was gonna ask if there was anything else though top of mind that either of you wanted to talk about in terms of just like, I guess, how you've been working together. Obviously, we've covered quite a bit about like why optimism, like why there's an advantage to building on an L2 like Optimism and Ethereum L2 like Optimism. But yeah, I want to make sure we cover everything that's top of mind for you, and then would like to open it up to the audience if anyone has questions for either of you. So, anyways, we'll start with either of you then. So, anything else top of mind that you guys would like to discuss?
I mean, mine is more. I don't know how close we catch up a bit. And I've like invested in a lot of the Synthetix ecosystems projects. So like I probably talked more in the past 2 months to some of the things that spun out of Synthetix and even Kain himself. But realistically, there hasn't been a lot of like opportunity for BarnBridge and Synthetix to work together outside of like, we have like smart alpha pools on Optimism that have SNX. Like we will enable like SUSD into like deposits on Aave. So like we will basically go in and integrate that wherever we can, just more so probably out of my respect for Synthetix and Kain being a massive supporter since like the early days of BarnBridge. But a lot of the cooler things that like I would want to build into Synthetix, they run into the same problems that BarnBridge was running into, the smart yield product was running into on base Ethereum. There's a lot of transactions that cut into the alpha and the returns of the products themselves. So like I talked about building something called SynthBridge that basically farms capital and then slowly as like interest rates go up starts to buy like SUSD shorts against like, you know, assets that would go up in value. But like the amount of transactions on all of those rebases are substantial, so it just doesn't make any sense. So especially for like our smart alpha product and where we build that longer term for V2, where like right now I'm building smart yield V2, smart alpha V2 is going to have to come after that. But like I'll be very interested in the perps product that Synthetix is pushing out, as well as you know, the options around what like Lyra is doing, because there's definitely ways that we could use a perps product or an options product to protect our downside if our DAO itself decides to actually join one of the sides of the pool. So yeah, I mean, the optimism, all of it probably took longer than I was expecting, which to Kane's point is just, that's the nature of crypto. But yeah, I think over time we will probably build closer and closer ties in because our products are very composable with each other.
Guys, one thing that has been an issue in terms of building on L2 has, I think, been a lack of like bridging access, which we're starting to see. You know, some tools go like more mainstream, like bridge aggregators are helping us find the cheapest, fastest ways to get to an L2. I'm not sure if you know anything more about centralized exchanges building directly to Optimism, but beyond that, like what other sort of infrastructure or just tooling do you
I
think
can
is
confirm that
needed?
is happening though. Like
That
centralized
is, oh, good.
exchanges are building to Optimism.
Yeah. So then beyond those on ramps and off ramps, I guess Kane, anything else that you think about that's like important from a tooling perspective or infrastructure perspective for Optimism to start to grow in usage?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, literally the Optimism network, and I, I've played around a little bit on Arbitrum as well, is like ETH1 in 2019, right? Like it is hilarious. Like if you were doing anything before DeFi summer, the inefficiency in every aspect of the network is like just amazing. So if you want to know what like L1 was like back then, just go and do a transaction on Optimism. Obviously, transactions are much faster and cheaper. That's great, but things that you expect like arbitrage just don't happen, right? So like the other day I was doing some transaction and I was like trying to convert something from one thing to another. I think I was doing a transaction on 1inch, and it was kind of a random token, and so like I sold some, and then I was like, oh, I'll give it 20 minutes and like wait for like it to get out, then I'll come back and do the rest of the transaction, and literally came back 20 minutes later and was still sitting there. There's just free money lying around everywhere, and I think that speaks to your point. Like the efficiency of bridges makes all of the other kind of second order arbitrage processes much harder. I do think upcoming debt pool merge, the debt synthesis that Synthetix is about to do, and the launch of synth teleporters will make that much easier, because all of a sudden you'll have, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of SUSD that can flow back and forth between Optimism and L1, and it will be able to do so very quickly, and fairly cheaply. So I do think that the fact that we now have Curve, Uniswap, V3, and several other AMM solutions plus aggregators like 1inch sitting on both networks will kind of get the efficiency going, but there's other inefficiencies there, right? Like, it's hard to borrow, significant amounts of funds against like even ETH, for example, on Optimism. So there's just a whole range of things that exist on L1 that everyone expects, even though they're very expensive to do, that are just not yet there on Optimism. But I do think that it's kind of rapidly catching up. But the fundamental thing is that you're not going to get users making the effort to migrate across until you have a couple of things. One is, I think you need some fundamental incentive alignment, which I think is going to come from roll-up tokens. So there's obviously going to be an Arbitrum token, there's going to be an Optimism token, there's probably going to be a Stockware token, and I think that those tokens will drive significant adoption, because all of a sudden, users can have exposure to the network that they're using, which aligns incentives. And then I think the second thing is you just need cool stuff. That's all people care about. They don't care about the security properties. They care about costs, to a certain extent, but only up to a point, right? Like if they're priced out, then obviously they can't use a network. But beyond that, they just want to use the coolest, newest, most speculative, craziest thing, right? And I just think we're going to have a proliferation of really novel, cool, experimental things happening on Optimism over the next like 3 to 6 months, where you have, Lyra built on Synthetix, and then something being built on Lyra, and then something being combined with that thing to create like some novel kind of solution. And I just think people are going to want to play around with that stuff, and that's going to force people across the network. But all of these things are just going to take time. It's going to take probably another 3 to 6 months, I think, but it's definitely happening. It's just the momentum is kind of building slowly at the moment, and it has been building for the last couple of months.
I think that's also because there's ARB opportunities on Optimism, but those ARB opportunities in 2019 didn't have to be like that big for people to get excited about them. Now I think that like crypto, at least like in terms of like our bags, has probably all grown. And so like where all this liquidity's gotten fragmented across all of these L2s and other L1s, I don't think we necessarily pay attention as much to like smaller scale, like a $3,000 type opportunity. But I do think that I think all of these projects are going to kick on incentives, and a lot of the promise of interoperability that creates like, I don't know what to call this, but like maybe prolonged, like quicker, like splices of ARB, where I was talking about like high frequency traders and like prop desks and like traditional Wall Street. They're sometimes arbing like sub pennies, and just over the volume of the number of transactions that becomes real. And in a weird way, we moved away from that as ETH gas fees went up, where like we stopped going after ARBOPs that just weren't like, unless it was one big ARB opportunity that you could do in a quick transaction, just with fees going up the way that they did. However, like as more capital and liquidity moves into Optimism and more projects are building into each other, you do start to lower the threshold of the size of the RBOPs that you want to go after and try to get more wins. So like more smaller wins is normally the way that you have prolonged success in finance, not massive quick clips that can make your month. So that naturally, I think that's why the projects that we're building on Optimism is what made me more bullish about it. Like, I'm not an investor in Optimism. I don't own anything. I'm literally moving there because I see a lot of other talented people and talent-filled projects moving to Optimism. And I think naturally you go where the talent goes, later the capital follows. And we're going to see that.
Tyler, I have a follow up on that with BarnBridge. So, if we summarize like some of the major updates with Synthetix lately, and if it wasn't already obvious, full disclosure, I hold SNX and stake SNX. I clearly hold bond and work with 4RC as an investor in BarnBridge. When I used to stake originally with Synthetix, I was staking only on L1. I eventually migrated to L2, which was a challenge for some just because they had to pay off their debt. Some of the major updates lately, which has been like a windfall for everyone, is so there's the debt pool synthesis, bringing the L1 and L2 debt together. So now debt is equivalent on L1 or L2. And this has been interesting to me because like it leaves the door open for us to still stake on L1, like if someone prefers it. I know I still probably have more of my portfolio on L1, even though I'm using applications on L2 and beyond. So there was that. There's the synth teleporters that we talked a bit about, which, to dumb that down, if you have a synth on L1, you can basically now move that to L2 or backwards the other way, and that's a win for those of us who have held synths. And then well, okay. Anyways, my thought here is there's been sort of like a merging of L1 and L2 then for users of Synthetix. Tyler, do you envision that to be the same then for BarnBridge, or?
I don't think so. Like, I understand your question, and I don't think there's a massive need for it. The only reason that I'm focused on ETH L1 at all is because of fiat, which
right.
Until we can bridge fiat to Optimism, which I probably need to talk to the Optimism team about. And also, like, BarnBridge is not going to be like, we have to create a whole new token the way that, Haven had to when it became Synthetix. I don't know if it was for the same reasons Lin turned into Aave, but there's fundamental issues with the bond token, and it's that you can't basically mint any more of it, which affects like how we handle like rewards in our system and incentives in our system. And we're just kind of behind where Synthetix and Aave launched. But both of them later down the line ended up moving to a new token as well. So a lot of the staking on L1, like, we're not going to like incentivize bond staking because we want as much to transfer over as humanly possible. So it would be like misincentives. But really, outside of the projects that are already on Optimism, being like Aave, the whole Synthetix ecosystem, Uniswap, and then the fact that you can do kind of like a Uni V2 type experience using that Gelato GUS GUni. I just don't see it, other than the capital on L1, as being enticing enough, because I do think that like with things like Hot Protocol, and it sounds like with these like Synthetix like zaps, I need to look into these, because that's something that like I've been trying to work through for BarnBridge in particular, is how we port money back and forth. Originally, I wasn't even going to have anything on base layer Ethereum until I realized that we pretty much have to get fiat over to Synthetix, to Optimism in some capacity. And the other thing is where when we basically move to the Barn token, we're going to utilize bonding, which is like an innovation that Olympus brought to the market. But Olympus is doing two things. It's doing bonding and it's doing rebasing. The bonding itself is no different than Abenomics or like VE, right? It's just two sides of the same coin. Like Curve token economics are 100% discount for a 3-year lock. Well, Olympus is a 10% discount for like a 5-day lock. So what I like about that is that you can pivot and change things on a more rapid capacity when you only made a 5-day mistake. With VE, the can kick out 3 years. I mean, we'll know in a year and a half if that was right for Curve, but I don't like those degrees of cycles, like when things change as fast as they do in crypto. So like, I want to adopt this bonding mechanism over VE, as opposed to like not even worrying about like rebasing with Olympus. However, I also don't want like BarnBridge just to become like a bonding protocol where the empowerment of like governance to be able to dictate all of those things, I think naturally will cause a lot of like feature requests and edits, but that's not core to our protocol. We're essentially just bonding to bring liquidity into the protocol so we can join. All of our products have two sides. And so I think it's more capital efficient if the DAO itself is joining one of the sides, and then allowing people to come in and deposit into the market. Otherwise, we're basically like in this reflexive loop where one side needs to be there for the other side to be incentivized. So I need to talk to Optimism about getting as much of fiat infrastructure as they're comfortable with moving. And then also I had to talk Zeus into moving to Optimism for Olympus, because like I don't want to run a bonding, like that's what they do. They have Olympus Pro. They're experts at bonding. I'd rather long term just use Olympus Pro as opposed to our fork and iteration of it, because that is core to what they do. In the same way that like for Smart Alpha, long term, I don't want to build a whole synthetic asset network to build price volatility plays within it. So
I certainly wouldn't if I were you. It's all fun.
yeah, don't worry. Just fixed income's hard enough. But ultimately if Olympus and Fiat have capacity on Optimism, I really don't see a major reason to even be using ETH L1 long term. And that thesis is built off of this concept that I still think ETH base layer transactions are just going to go up and up and up and up over time, where like a lot of stuff is going to become gas or dust. Like I try to keep track of how much I have on ETH L1, because if I have sub $1,000 deposits in certain pools, like I just write them off until times like now when I can go get them all out and free them. But like for a time there, it just didn't even make sense. That's why I'm pushing to move now to Optimism while I'm seeing innovation start to prop up there. Because like, yeah, we're in Goblin Town right now, but Goblin Town ends quickly. Like this war could end tomorrow. And I don't think the Fed raising interest rates is going to nuke us that much. So like this shit can come back very quickly. And I don't want to be on the other end having to code at that point to move, because when we weren't in Goblin Town, the ETH transaction fees 100% hurt and damaged BarnBridge on the fix side. And so, yeah, we need to fix it now.
Yeah, actually, I have a question for both of you, but Kain, I'd like to have you weigh in first because of just how enormous Synthetix is as a project and how long you've been building it. So I've thought a lot before about for someone like you that was building before others, there's almost like a builder debt that you have. Like, you got an application out before others, you built a community, and yes, obviously there's a lot of support for Synthetix, but then now with L2s going live and even like other L1s that have, grown a lot over the last few years, those that are launching fresh new protocols, like, they can obviously start anew. There's other challenges that come with it, but they get to start anew with all those like advantages. And when I think about like the debt pools, just merging those debt pools and all the steps you've had to go through with Synthetix. Curious, what's your perspective on like the pros and cons of having to work through all of these migration features to get us from L1 to L2 with Synthetix. Oh shoot, Kain got kicked out a sec. Hold up, I'm just re-adding him. Hopefully you heard all that.
I can at least like start to answer that, at least from, oh wait, no, Kain's back on. Listener.
There we go. Yep, Kain.
Yeah,
were you
sorry,
able to hear
I
that
did drop
question?
out
Just
for a second, but
yeah.
I think I got the gist of the question. Like, the nightmare that the last 4 years of building has been, was it worth it?
Exactly.
Essentially is the TLDR
you think
there,
you'd
I think,
be
right?
rewarded.
So
Yeah, you'd think you'd be rewarded, but instead I feel like you like Compound, Aave, like anyone that was building before, it's almost like you've been punished because now you got to do all the work of figuring out how do I transfer that value and get all these users from L1 to L2. But anyways,
yeah, look, I think it's a very good question. I think we have absolutely been rewarded, the people who were here and continued building through the bear market. I think we've been rewarded financially. I think we've been rewarded with an awareness and knowledge of how to build systems in this space that is hard to replicate quickly. You can kind of turn up now, and there's a bunch of really great tooling, and you can kind of get started and get a lot of momentum, but there's just certain patterns of thinking and that I think you can only acquire over a long time with a lot of pain, and so I guess, like, ideologically, I look at the last 4 years of Synthetix and what we've built, and yes, it's been much harder than we expected, but there's things that have come out of that, like, even the yield farming contracts that that Anton wrote back in the day, from 1inch with us, that we released, that like became this kind of primitive, and obviously we're exploited for some crazy Ponzi schemes, but we're incorporated into some really cool things as well. I think Robert in the past has said kind of similar things about building the compound governance module, right? Like, that was a huge investment that was then given. When you're working in an open source ecosystem, you do a lot of things that don't get directly rewarded necessarily, right? And I think Synthetix and Aave and Compound and a lot of the early projects have very much done that. And there's a whole bunch of things that we have built, or concepts that we sort of tested early and dealt with the pain of kind of working through and iterating on to like get to a point where they are viable, that I look at and say, like, okay, there was no direct benefit to Synthetix, but I'm ideologically aligned with the kind of goals of crypto, right? And the goals of Ethereum and the goals of the Ethereum ecosystem. So I don't really care whether Synthetix directly benefited from those things, because I think there's a larger purpose that we're trying to achieve here. And so I feel very validated that we were able to invest and create some of these things and contribute, irrespective of any direct benefit that we got. But I think it's unquestionable that a bunch of people who are in Synthetix and in these early DeFi projects have benefited greatly. But I do think there is this like second order effect, which I sleep better at night knowing that we've kind of contributed so much, I guess, knowledge and awareness to the space. It's probably the thing that I'm most proud of over kind of anything is what Synthetix has contributed back to the ecosystem. So yes, it's been painful, but I think it's been worth it, and I would absolutely do it all again. That said, we still have a job at hand, which is like deliver something on Optimism and migrate people across, and there's still a process there. But I think we have a pretty good handle on how to get there. I think we know what the release of futures looks like. There's going to be some work post launch to kind of again iterate and optimize futures. But I think once we have a genuine composable perpetual futures market on Optimism, that's going to be a primitive that is going to unlock a whole bunch of really cool things that people can compose into it, and it's just going to be amazing to finally kind of have that live. So it's been a journey, but I think it's been worth it.
I'd also tack on that, like, one of the things that, like, Travis, you were like alluding to is like there's like ultimately like legacy debt from these like earlier projects. And so like Synthetix definitely has to do things different than if like someone just launched like a synthetic asset project on Optimism. But I think that people discount like a true, like how Lindy effects work. Like when I was like, I had a falling out with some of the people on my dev team. And so like investors and other people suggested that if I want to bring BarnBridge V2 in the direction I wanted to, then just go and fork the whole project and rename it like Moneypenny and like move on. And so I didn't want to do that. And so like coming from someone that's been a part of a lot of projects, has launched numerous tokens, for me to say like, I don't think that you should launch a token unless you absolutely have to, like I still truly believe that. And one of the reasons for that is I don't think it's as easy as people think it is to launch a new project. We just are bombarded with so many new projects like in the last bull that it seemingly felt like everything was happening so fast. But if you just paid attention to one singular project, nothing happened that fast. It's just that 12 projects went to 100 projects, went to 1,000 projects, and there was like a new ohm fork every week that wasn't really bringing any value to the ecosystem. But inside of each one of those, it wasn't progressing in that same clip or capacity. And so where I would say that I'm still to this day like far more bullish on Synthetix than I am on other like if I saw a competitor pop up is 1,000% that where you can look at it in one way as technical debt and people being able to come up with like more creative Ponzi-nomics or some cool methodology of like distributing a token. At the end of the day, like when I talked to Dan Loeb about DeFi and tried to teach him how to use it, like he didn't know what like KlimaDAO was. Like he knew what Synthetix was and he owned it. So like these traditional financial groups, when they do come in with better insurance in place and a little more technical technical knowledge, but regulatory clarity, they're going to go first to Synthetix. Like they're going to go first to Aave. Like that's who Mark Cuban was tweeting about. And those projects also have very, very deep communities. And those communities themselves are ultimately what the brand is. So like when you look at like traditional finance looks at all of this a lot different than degens do. They're not willing to go to the next Titan rug pull and fall off their bike like Mark Cuban did. Not with like meaningful amounts of customer client capital. They're going to stick with the ones that have been there for a long time, building and building properly. So like this bull market kind of Ponzi-nomics and launch a new token every single week, and then maybe it's a rug, maybe it's not. If it's a rug, it's a write-off. I'll make it up back on the next trade. That's just not how the real world works. And so these projects that have been in this space for a long time and have done things the right way and haven't had major like technical glitches and massive losses of user funds, like they don't necessarily do as well in an up market, where things can just catapult from 0 to 100 like instantaneously. However, they do better on a 10-year time frame. And so I think that's what we're going to see, where this whole debate about DeFi 1 versus DeFi 2, and people said DeFi 1 was never going to come back. I wholeheartedly don't believe that, even though BarnBridge is somewhere in between DeFi 1 and DeFi 2. Like, we're not as old as Synthetix, we're not as new as Olympus. Like, I would say that I think BarnBridge has name recognition. My name is tied to it. It has a community that's stuck around and cares. And so I didn't want to change it. I didn't want to fork it, even if it would have been easier in the short run. In the long run, that's not good business. It's not even from an altruistic or ethical perspective. It's just, I truly think that the Lindy effects of these brands in DeFi 1 are like, I envy Synthetix and Aave for the name recognition that they have. And that name recognition is tied to founders that stuck it out through a down market and continued to build in a community that didn't do sketchy shit. And you can't buy that with a bunch of multi-coin money.
I definitely, Kain, on your gravestone, you got to put Kain. He didn't do sketchy shit. That will be that will be part of the legacy. Um,
Not just
no,
Kain, like that whole community, the whole Synthetix
no.
community.
I get you. Obviously, I'm like kidding around. Hey, I want to make sure I'm mindful of your guys' time in case you need to drop here soon. One thing that was mentioned, and I want to lean again on like Kain's longer journey or more experience that he's had just being in crypto for such a longer time than any of us. So I don't think it's like any secret, like with BarnBridge, like it seems pretty likely that we'll see a new token in the future. It just, a lot has changed. We've lived through a bull run that's led to, thankfully, the likes of Optimism enabling us to move to L2 and being able to spend less gas to do really powerful things in DeFi. And so, anyways, as we think about like using fixed income products where you can like borrow against that position with something like BarnBridge on Optimism, I would love to get any lessons you had, Kain, from the token migration or basically the project migration that you lived through from Haven to Synthetix. Anything that you can sort of like distill for us from that time, which probably seems so long ago, but really was only a few years ago.
I bumped that question because I probably should have asked Kain and Stani that a while ago.
Yeah, so back in the day, I think there were two options for upgrades, right? There was the kind of fork upgrade, right? Aura style or whatever. There were a number of examples back in like 2017 when projects needed to do migration, and they were just a nightmare. And I think that Synthetix made a decision that we would build this system behind proxy contracts and start very centralized and then slowly decentralize it. We got a lot of shit for that, in the early days, but I think it did make sense. So even the migration from Haven to Synthetix was still kind of a forced migration. The system was kind of forced migrated using a multi-sig effectively. Where I think we're about to maybe do something that we haven't done previously for a long time is the migration to V3. So V3 will be a new token. There will be like the ability for people to kind of migrate. Maybe the closest thing is allowing people to migrate from L1 to Optimism. That process required user intervention. Required kind of building a whole bunch of like interface work to kind of support exactly how people can kind of go through that process. I do think these days people are more kind of comfortable with the idea of like forced migrations. But I think for some things, if you want to really get rid of like all the technical debt, which we do, moving from V2X to V3, you just need a clean slate. And if you want a clean slate, you probably need to just deploy an entirely new system and let people migrate at will to that new system. So I think we actually have a huge migration ourselves coming up that we need to think a lot about, and we have been thinking a lot about. That is just going to be a very different one to previous ones. So I don't know if I have too much really to add in terms of like learnings of like how to do a migration. I think the key thing is, ensuring that the community engagement is as high as possible, right? And that you have buy-in from the community that this is the right decision, and that the way that it's being done is being done correctly. I think the nice thing with Synthetix these days is that governance is so decentralized that it's really hard for something to happen without the community being in support of it. So I think that getting community buy-in for any kind of contentious process like a token migration is super critical. That's probably the only thing that I would kind of say is important. Other than that, I think everything that you do is kind of dependent on particular circumstances. But I think that is kind of a global thing. You need to have consensus within the community if you want to do a migration.
We need a degen Spartan. I
Are
think
you
that's what
saying
BarnBridge
that
is
you're
missing.
gonna move to a new token other than SNX, or you're talking about a full system migration?
It's a system migration. It'll be a new SNX token. So almost definitely there'll be a new SNX. So the 0x collat contract that is the existing SNX token that was deployed back in whenever it was, like I think December 2018, will be no more, and there'll be a new SNX token contract. But users will have to migrate to it manually. There's still a bit of debate about whether that's actually the case, or whether we can do a kind of forced migration, or whether or not it'll need to be like require user intervention. But I'm kind of leaning towards this idea of letting users migrate themselves to this new system.
Yeah, that's what I did as well. But I have a question. So why are you doing that? Like,
because we have 4 years of technical debt. Like every single thing that we touch, every single change that we make now just requires so much context and awareness. And so when we split the V3 team and the V2 team, what we started with V3 was basically building an entirely new proxy architecture, which they've done. And that proxy architecture is a modern proxy architecture that like factors in all of the things that we've learned over the last 4 years. And so building on that new proxy architecture, building modules for it is going to be significantly easier. And we can basically just throw away. There's so many things that we did in the old Synthetix system that didn't work. That you've got these like vestigial limbs that are just sticking out. It's like a monstrosity. And so we just want to basically do away with all of that and start fresh.
is that due to like you being worried that like, so the way that the Synthetix token is used as like a backstop to like the V1 versions of like SUSD, or like the short and long version of like oil or something, like if one of those was to get adopted in some unforeseen circumstance and plugged into something, that creates like an attack vector where moving to a new token, you can basically say like, because we can't turn off any of these old contracts, like we need a new token in order to like truly upgrade the entire system to a more capital efficient one. Like that's
No, I mean it's based like you have an existing working system, right? That is literally held together with like duct tape, right? And if you even look at it the wrong way, it could potentially fall apart, right? And so what we want to do is take all of the functionality, all of the things that we know we need, all the components. So an example is like staking, right? With staking, we have this weird, 4 years ago, we didn't know what the fuck we were doing, right? And we had this weird thing where you had these epoch-based staking kind of process where like every week there's a snapshot and it's exploitable. And this has been going on for years and years and years, right? And now every staking system that you look at is done in continuous time, right? And a lot of that came out of some of the things that we built through yield farming and the staking rewards, sol contract, and all of that stuff. But like the idea of like taking epoch-based snapshots for staking is just crazy. So we basically want to rebuild the staking module in continuous time and plug that into this new proxy architecture. But you can't do that in the existing Synthetix system very easily because there's just so many different contracts and things that expect staking to operate in a certain way. So this is why we just want a clean slate, start fresh, and that's what V3 is giving us.
Does it have anything to do with like composability between L2s as well? Because like the one
I feel like you're looking for some kind of like conspiracy. Like it's a very simple explanation. Like the existing system is extremely old, has a whole bunch of legacy code in it, and we just want to flush it out and rebuild the system, knowing everything that we know, starting fresh. It's like if you were to rebuild, I don't know, Ethereum for today, right? There's a whole bunch of things that you would do very differently. Unfortunately, we can't do that because Ethereum needs to continue running, right? And this is the situation we have with Synthetix. Synthetix can't just be stopped, and we can't just go and restart it over there with some new system. Like it's literally down to just trying to find a way to migrate to a new kind of architecture.
Yep. No, honestly, I wasn't. So I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. Like
that was a joke. That was a joke.
No, I was more asking just because like we're moving our token right now, and I've had to put a lot of thought into looking into like why Lynn turned to Aave, like why Haven turned to Synthetix, like, but I think those were like old, and they're not really that relevant today. So a lot of like the more innovative thought processes that I've seen around token migrations that I think maybe I just need to hop into the Synthetix Discord and like just drop like a couple paragraphs on like the last like 3 months of my research. But really the things that I think that are becoming like pretty important are like basically cross-layered composability. So like a lot of the work that like Olympus did, as much as everybody wants to call like Olympus a Ponzi scheme or whatever they want to say about Olympus, those kids are smart as fuck and they write really good code and they're working their asses off. So like that to me, a lot of the thought processes around like why Geom exists versus like Som, some of the reasons that they did some of those things I think are very important. But I think where this is going to actually go to where like if there's a like BarnBridge V3 versus just BarnBridge V2, which has to do with like rewards and the ability to like basically remove all of the barriers of the token and fully put the DAO in control of that. Where there's no limitations that were put in by us in the beginning. It's ultimately this DAO is fully in control of what happens to this token. One thing though that I do think is something that I feel like if we were to migrate to a V3, it would have to do with all of the ways that like LPs could be involved in governance, or like borrowed positions could be involved in governance. Especially once you have a whole bunch of like various layer twos, because even though I'm focused on Optimism, that doesn't mean that someone can't just port stuff to Arbitrum and then basically set up a lending market that BarnBridge is used as collateral there, or like the Barn token. So I think, I guess my thought process was you kind of start with the token and you're forever kind of stuck with some of the beginning bases of that. And I very much have mentally shifted my model of that and said, I think there's going to be a lot of reasons that we continually upgrade these tokens for prolonged periods of time. And yeah, I mean, I think we have to think through all the reasons that we're doing it, but I I would definitely encourage you to. Well, I'll just try to consolidate some feedback on some of the research I've done, just so that um, even if the synthetics community doesn't like necessarily respect like Olympus, I still think that some of the reasoning around these all these various tokens that it has are smart, and then also just some concerns that I have in the back of my head that particularly have to do with like um, I think when we made governance tokens, we didn't really think through that the LPs don't have like a vote, and I think that's probably something we need to think through as an industry. We just don't like. There's other lower hanging fruit to worry about, but I do think long term that it could become a problem if there's these massive liquidity pools that port over during large votes. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point. I was more asking just because I've put so much thought into it over the past quarter, and I figure you guys are porting a token for a different reason than some of the newer projects have, and so like that's why I was just generally curious.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, just fascinating. Like appreciate you sharing all that, then, Kane. And we probably should end here. I don't want to cut you guys off because I just
No, no,
assume,
yeah, agreed,
yeah,
agreed.
you probably
Yeah,
got
Yeah,
to
my
hop
wife's
off
giving
here.
me that eye.
I ate a steak while in the background while you guys were talking. So no, Kane, anything else you want to share though before we go? Just want to give you the last word here.
yeah. I mean, just look out for launch of futures coming up. I'm not going to give an exact timeline because someone will murder me. I think I might have already done that earlier this week, but yeah, it's imminent. Synthetix, extra Synthetix.
Absolutely, yeah. If anybody wants to learn about Synthetix, if you've been living in a cave the last few years, it's synthetix.io. And then BarnBridge, of course, is at barnbridge.com. And yeah, just this was awesome, guys. I appreciate you taking the time. Sorry we went a little bit over here, and totally look forward to talking to you soon, okay?
Hey,
Thank
this
you
was
so
a
much, Travis. Thanks for hosting.
pleasure for me.
Bye, guys. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.